I attended a webinar conversation between Ruby Sales, one of the great civil rights leaders who is still with us, and our UCC Associate General Minister, Reverend Tracy Blackman. In conversation, Ruby Sales named what she called one of the callings of our time: the spiritual crisis of white America. She called on people who have lost touch with their folk cultures, especially white people, but not just white people, to seek and to find their grandmothers' and grandfathers' stories, to know and to claim their roots, their ancestors, and their wisdom teachings. To Ruby Sales, this knowledge is medicine for the spirit, which has the potential to grow the tenacity and courage that we will need to extricate ourselves and each other from the grip of what she calls the capitalist technocracy. It's a corrupt system, this capitalist technocracy, in which very few lives matter. Black, brown, and indigenous lives least of all. This capitalist technocracy feeds on the fantastic hegemonic imagination, Emily Town's insight that was referenced by Reverend Rajiv last week. And at the end of the webinar, Ruby Sales took questions. An older white gentleman asked if he could speak. And even in that little Zoom box that we've all grown accustomed to, anyone could see the struggle on his face. He shared that he was adopted as an infant by an Amish family. And as a young man in his late teens, he left his Amish community, vowing never to return. I'll never forget that next moment, because Ruby Sales asked him, "What made you trade your Amish heritage for the dominant culture?" He couldn't find words to respond to that question. He said something about not being able to relate to Amish identity, and Ruby Sales was gentle with him. She said something like, "No folk culture is perfect. They're all flawed, and they are all in need of redemption. But without that sense of belonging, without a people, how do you get started?" And I kept thinking to myself as I was listening to this exchange, I am this man. You might have guessed by now that it is at the bidding of anti-racist wisdom teachers like Ruby Sales, Resma Menakem, the author of My Grandmother's Hands, and others, that Reverend Rajiv and I decided to spend the summer here at Parkside on Christian Folx and Folklore. Folks spelled with an X, to further expand and disrupt the culture of gender and racial hierarchies. Both Rajiv and I, over the course of this time, we will honor the imperfect and beautiful Christian folk traditions that we come from, and we'll hear from other community members too. Jeff Manilli is going to share with us, Reverend Michael Dack, Craig Womack, and he's bringing his friend and one of my theologian heroes, Reverend Rosemary McCombs Maxey, all the way from Georgia and Oklahoma. And then to finish the series, Reverend Elizabeth Griswold will return to preach, and she's going to bring Rabbi Seth Castleman with him, and I imagine he'll have a story to tell us. And we'll hear this wisdom drawn from these many folk traditions in relationship to the wisdom of our spiritual teacher, Jesus. And along the way, I hope you feel this as an invitation, a grand invitation to remember or maybe recover the wisdom that you find in your folk tradition, whatever it is. And I want to hear about it. I have two primary ancestral traditions that I know about. I'm Scottish on my mom's side. I know there's a few other Scottish people in the room, or partly Scottish people. And on my dad's side, I've inherited the folk cultural identity that academics label Germans from Russia. And I know there's a lot of us in the United States and Canada as well. If you ask my grandma, my paternal grandma, who her people are, she knows. But she would not go into a big academic explanation. She would say, we're farmers. If you asked her why her people left Russia to come to America, she'd say, they had to. It was really bad there. It must have been really bad there because nobody ever talked to us about it. And they came here because they heard there was farm work and land. As far back as I've been able to research my people, I found that they had always been a tightly bound group of German-speaking farming migrants who moved from place to place as necessitated by economic hardship, religious and cultural persecution, and the geopolitical boundary line shifts that kept happening across them. They traversed Eastern Europe for centuries, and the wave of immigration to the Dakotas in the late 1800s and early 1900s was survival to my family, and also part of an orchestrated theft of Native people's land, which was coordinated by the United States and Canadian governments in partnership with railroad companies. I live in this conflicted legacy as the descendant of my European immigrant ancestors. From my grandmothers and my great uncles and aunties and my dad's generation, I've learned that in those early years following their immigration, and in some ways still today, my people just sort of moved about the space with their heads down. They did as they were told by government authorities. They didn't expect anything from folks outside of their community. Having each other was enough. Some were Catholic, Mennonite, Lutheran, Hutterite. It's a smaller group. And in my immediate family's case, Seventh-day Adventist. All of these folks shared a language and an umbrella folk culture, which the elders are doing their very best to protect and to pass on to us. I suppose this insular type of community is typical of folks who have needed to forge an identity while living a diasporic life. The social historical context that undergirds the wisdom teachings of my people, wisdom always forms and passes down through the generations contextually. And we have to know our context in order to understand better the wisdom. In a global society especially, when we all need to be in conversation with one another about our people's wisdom, you need to know yours, and I need to know mine, so that we might come together and talk about how best to meet this moment in our collective history. Wisdom for Jesus arose in a social context too. In the conflicted world of first century Mediterranean area, that space where Jesus and those followers of him, soon after he died, that space they occupied, the people gathering around Jesus' wisdom were living in times of great uncertainty, times of migration, and the struggle to see a way forward. In Luke's gospel, the wisdom teachings reinforce the principles of faithfulness to an ancestral call to spend one's life in the service of God's redemptive work in the world. There was to be nothing left over, but life must be spent thoroughly. In our scriptural wisdom story for today, which Reverend Rajiv just shared with us, When someone asks Jesus to help them settle an inheritance dispute, he tells a story that undermines the whole idea of property inheritance in the first place. Isn't that just like Jesus to do that kind of thing? He says, one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. We could just stop there in this capitalist technocracy that we live in. One's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. Then the story that he tells, which illustrates this point, is about a rich farmer whose land produces much more than he needs. So what does the farmer do? He tears down his small barns and he builds bigger barns to hold all his stuff, all his extra. And then he decides, now I can sit back and enjoy life off this excess. This isn't life, Jesus says. It's foolishness. And Jesus goes on to say, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, because in the end, when it comes time to say goodbye to this life, when God asks for an account of the ways that you've spent your life, and all you have to show is hoarded possessions, what account can you give? Especially when those resources might have been useful to others' lives. God is not at all interested in your stockpiled stuff. God's redemptive work is in expanding life and love. Your kingdom work is the only inheritance you need to worry about. If you keep on reading the chapter, you'll read Jesus telling us, not to worry about our material needs at all. Let the food, the shelter, the clothing pass through you as if they are God's, not yours, meant for God's work, never yours to stockpile or inherit in the first place. These wisdom teachings are strong medicine for our capitalist technocratic times. And they remind me of a couple German-Russian folk proverbs that my dad heard growing up, and he passed on to me and my sister and my kids. And they go like this: when you share, you always have enough. And another one closely related: there is always room for one more. Your dad and mom too, Patty. I'm fortunate to live in the legacy of these sayings, and I've seen them embodied in my German-Russian community and family. My dad's dad died in a farming accident, leaving my grandma and 5 children, ages 6 weeks old to 8 years, 5. Over and over again, at different stages in my own life, I have asked my dad, how did you guys manage? How did Grandma do it? And there have been many times, I think, I asked because I needed to hear again and again to be reassured that I come from people who know how to make it through hard times. And he always tells me his whole community rallied around to help. That's how they made it. His grandparents moved in to their 2-bedroom house. Was really a granary converted to living space. Neighbors provided farm labor, equipment, and food. And when he and his siblings got a little older and their farm did a little better, then they shared their food and their labor and their equipment and space because they needed, my dad's 2 cousins moved in with them for a while, adding 2 more bodies to 3 beds shared by 8 people. I've heard lots of people, including myself, talk about the level of poverty that my dad and his family lived with. He didn't live, and I just confirmed this by text this morning to make sure. He did not live in a house with a flush toilet until he was 17 years old. But though all of us have talked about their poverty, I've never once heard my grandma or my dad or aunts or uncles ever talk about growing up poor. My grandma always said, we had fun. We ice skated. We played ball. We worked hard, but we had fun too. When you share, you always have enough. There is always room for one more. Strong medicine to heal the pain of living in a capitalist technocracy. Well, my dad just expects everyone to operate with these principles. If he needs something you have, including a few hours of your life, or a room in your house for a guest that he has coming to visit, he'll just come out and ask you if he can borrow it. He'll also freely give you anything he has that you might need. As a kid trying to grow up in mainstream culture, I was often really embarrassed by the way that my dad just behaves as if we live in this flow and flux of shared time and energy and resources and materials. He'll walk into his family members' and friends' kitchens and open drawers and cupboards, looking for things without asking. And he doesn't mind if you ask my mom, though. She'll be happy to share with you. She just wants to know what it is that you're getting. When I think about it, I'm so grateful to have witnessed that model of never worrying about needs being met. Someone, somewhere, has what I need, always. I just need to feel the freedom to ask. And to think about what I was going to say today, I found a new question that might be valuable to you too, so I offer it now. How is my grandmother's, and by grandmother, I mean that in the largest way, all the grandmotherly influences in your life, or grandfatherly influences, or grandparently influences, how is their wisdom or like or different from Jesus' wisdom? What do you find at that intersection of wisdom and witness? Here are a couple of the ways that my grandmother's storied wisdom connects with Jesus, at least from my perspective. They were both deeply rooted in the faith of their communities. They knew how to make food stretch miraculously. They always had leftovers to send home with people. Those in their care were taught to be accountable to justice. My cousins and I knew that if we hurt or disrespected any other human, we would hear it, maybe even feel it from my grandma. And neither Jesus nor my grandma got everything right all the time. They learned, sometimes as a result of their own mistakes, sometimes because of hardships beyond their control. And they both expected that those who came after them would do more, be more, make the world better more than they did. Their connection to God led them to ever widen their capacity to see people and to love them. My grandmother's immigrant parents, who only spoke German, could never have imagined that one day their daughter, at age 86, would travel to South Africa with her granddaughter, my cousin. My cousin won an all-expenses-paid trip through her work, I think, and she took my grandma as her plus one. And they went on this tour, whatever was included in this trip. And this tour bus made a stop at a touristy sort of cultural center. And instead of walking through the various displays that you're supposed to walk through of traditional South African life, my grandmother started talking with some of the women who worked there. And my cousin captured this moment and said, "Here, let me take your picture." And here it is. It's my favorite picture of my grandma. Somehow I see Jesus in the picture too. One's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. When you share, you always have enough. And there is room, always room, for one more. Amen.